Just a heads up for everyone who's joined already. We're live, but we're going to wait for until 5:30 to kick things off as advertised. So we're out there in the advertising in the real world, but we're going to pick this thing up in a couple minutes and get the show on the road at 5:30. Okay, I think we're at 5:30. Okay, well, this is a work session, so we don't have to have the formalities of calling to order. But wanted to thank the agency and committee and commission members for all joining us tonight. We're joined by members of our project team from DKS and MIG, and I expect we may be seeing some of our state partners as well joining in. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to do a little scoping and regulatory overview of some of the rules and regs and processes that are going to drive phase 2 of the project. Again, as you know, this is for the Heights Urban Renewal. This is 281. It is a state jurisdiction roadway, and for those of you, I guess, out there in the YouTube, this is a part of the city's urban renewal and streetscape project to look at specifically 12th and 13th and the really more the Heights Alturas core that sits between May and Belmont, looking at streetscape alternatives that meet some of the urban renewal goals for reinvestment in the area. So tonight, I think Nathan Polanski from MIG is going to lead and share much of the screen with some of the backstory and history, as well as some of the regulatory discussions. And I think he has a slide deck with some materials. I think we're looking for this to take about 2 hours time from the time that we go through in any discussion. I think we'll have an opportunity for you all to jump in with questions or things to share. Again, this is a work session for you all. I think it's important. This is a complex regulatory process. It's a complex environment, and knowing more about the regulations and rules that really drive some of this, some of the decisions and concepts will help you all evaluate some of the outcomes that we're looking at. We've gone from community input to agency goals. Now we're going to be looking at how, when the goals and the rules meet, what are the outcomes? And the better we are informed about those things, really, the better judges we can be on the concepts and the alternatives and why are we arriving here. So with that, I think we can, Nathan, are you gonna, I see you on here in a couple different ways. So, or Alex, I don't know who's gonna kick this off, or John. This is Nathan Polanski, MIG, Alex Dupe, MIG, John Boskett, DKS Associates, who's our traffic consultant, Tara Lingley from ODOT, and that's from our project team. So please, again, jump in. I don't want to make this overly formal, but I think we got a lot of material to cover, and hopefully you'll be entertained and educated by the time we get done with this.
Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction, Dustin. I think we see this kind of being fairly informal. We've got kind of a series of slides that take about 20 minutes to get through. I'm happy to kind of stop and kind of ask questions as we go if it works, and if it doesn't get kind of too confusing for folks to follow. So feel free to kind of chime in as needed. One of the things I did want to kind of curious, we had sent around, or Dustin sent out 3 attachments in advance of kind of with your packet. Those were the kind of a regulatory document review that we did early in phase 1, looking at different city and ODOT planning documents, kind of documenting policy regulations, kind of design standards, and kind of how those are going to be applicable for the project. That summarized kind of how we were planning to use that information moving forward. We'll be talking kind of mostly about a couple of the ODOT documents tonight, the Highway Design Manual and the Blueprint for Urban Design. The second document that was included in your packet was the project goals that were established during phase 1. That was kind of the last time we checked in with everyone with the agency board. You kind of saw the draft final goals. We made some minor modifications. And so that document was kind of included. And then the third file is one that you guys hadn't seen yet, and we're coordinating with ODOT to kind of get final confirmation on. But it has to do with the urban context of the project area and the corridors. And so that's going to be a fair amount of kind of what we present this evening. And so hopefully everyone had a chance to read through those. Some of this will kind of walk through and be a little bit redundant with that information. Are there any questions before I get started from folks? Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Try to get the right screen. All right. Okay. All right, cursor in the right spot. All right, so here's kind of what we want to talk about tonight. I wanted to kind of make sure, kind of step back and make sure everyone remembers just kind of where we are in our project process. So we'll kind of do a very quick kind of overview on kind of what we've done so far, where we're headed, and what we're kind of specifically going to be working on in phase 2. We'll be talking about the kind of current regulatory environment, recognizing that 12th and 13th and kind of the intersection and streets that join them as a couplet at the north and south ends are state highways, so they're under ODOT jurisdiction. Talk a little bit about the design process and kind of the ultimate kind of documentation and adoption process, and then kind of, I know one of the things that has come up in past conversations, and I think the first time that we met to talk about scope, there were questions about alternative, about jurisdictional transfer and kind of what an alternative process might look if the city were to take over kind of those kind of right of ways. And so we'll try to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully Tara from ODOT can help answer some additional questions as needed there. So we finished phase 1. We did kind of our initial kind of community, kind of stakeholder outreach. We've got a good sense from the community on some of the existing conditions and context and needs. Now we are entering phase 2 concept development. We're going to be, as a part of this, we're going to be developing concepts, reviewing those with the agency board and advisory committee and ODOT, as well as evaluation criteria, so that at the end of this project, phase 2 process, we can kind of have identified a preferred concept to move forward with in phase 3 when we're developing the plan. So what does that specifically look like for phase 2? So we're going to be, our scope includes developing 3 concepts for the study area. We'll be developing evaluation criteria based on kind of preferred kind of performance outcomes based on project goals and conversations that we've had with the community. We'll be meeting with the agency board and advisory committee to review those concepts and evaluation criteria. After we've reviewed that with you guys, we're going to be going to sit down with ODOT and review the same materials with them. We'll then work through an evaluation process kind of based on the criteria that's going to include a traffic study and traffic analysis that DKS is going to be doing as we look at kind of level of service and moving cars and from a traffic standpoint. But we also are going to be looking at, how comfortably and safely the bikes and people walking move through the corridors and through the intersections. We'll be reviewing that evaluation of the concepts with the agency board and advisory committee, reviewing that same material with ODOT, and then we'll be going out and presenting that information to the stakeholders in the community. At the end of the process, we'll be compiling that and making recommendation for the preferred concept to be developed in phase 3. So as a reminder, from a project study area, the map on the left is kind of the larger urban renewal area boundary. We're talking about just 12th and 13th through kind of the Heights, and a more commercial district between May and Belmont. On the right, there's the blown up map, and highlighted in yellow, those are the ODOT controlled streets. The streets that aren't highlighted, and this may be obvious, are under the city's jurisdiction. So those go through a different process, are held to kind of a, I guess, slightly different design standards and requirements. So 281, 12th and 13th is an urban highway, as designated within the highway design ODOT's highway design manual. It's a non-designated urban highway, so there's no special designation that goes with it. It's a district highway. There are no overlays. Other communities that have sort of a kind of main street or downtown kind of street feel where the state highway goes through, sometimes there are special overlays or designations called special transportation areas. That doesn't apply here. It's also not a truck route. I know that early on there were questions on whether, how involved kind of the freight community needed to be, and 281 is not a freight route. And so what does that mean from a maintenance standpoint? I know this question has come up in the past, but ODOT maintains the roadway. So they maintain the pavement surface, pavement markings, and kind of basically curb to curb. And the city maintains the sidewalk and kind of street environment behind the curb. The city maintains drainage infrastructure, the lighting, and the snow removal. This has been confirmed with ODOT. I know there's a question at one of our last meetings. Is there something in writing? Can we have something that kind of formalizes that from a city's perspective? We've asked ODOT to kind of look into that. So they are checking in with their maintenance folks to see if there is something formal for that. And Tara may be able to kind of speak to that a little bit more if there are further questions. But this is kind of both city and ODOT's understanding of who maintains what within the right-of-way, the ODOT right-of-way. So one thing that's I think is important for everyone to remember is the city does have a current plan for 12th and 13th Street heights. They are part of the adopted transportation system plan that was adopted in 2011. The graphic on the left is an excerpt from that document, and there are prescribed cross sections for 12th and 13th between May and Belmont. Both of those eliminate parking on the right-hand side of the road, kind of in the way that traffic is going, and replace that with a buffered bike lane. So I think this is really important when we're communicating to the community to understand what the current plan is, or kind of the do-nothing path for these streets. Parking is something that came up throughout our engagement process in phase one. DKS has started doing a parking study. That was one of the last times we met. We talked about kind of the amendment to add the parking study. So they were out there on Tuesday, and I think again on Saturday, to take parking counts to kind of understand what the kind of existing utilization and demand is. The city's TSP also includes kind of general recommendations for intersection improvements. And so at 13th in May and 13th in Belmont, the adopted TSP does note traffic signals would be provided at those intersections. And then there are at 12th in Belmont, there are also some minor recommendations for kind of improving that intersection, which is a two-way stop right now on the kind of Belmont east-west movement. So that's what's in the city's current plan. So as we're moving forward with kind of the board and advisory committee and the community to develop concepts for 12th and 13th, we're going to be following, because it's an ODOT highway, ODOT design manuals and their design standards. So these are three of the kind of key documents that sort of set some of that policy, standards, and requirements and process for our project. The document on the left is the Oregon Highway Plan. This is very high level document. It really sets and defines the policies and goals for the state's highway system. That's the thing that's most relevant, I guess, from our perspective, is this establishes the mobility targets, or the kind of capacity of the roadways that are required. And deviating from those requires approval from ODOT. And so they set that, I guess, what it's called the kind of maximum level of congestion that's accepted on the roadways. And people that are kind of more familiar, kind of sort of like a traffic level of service standard. The middle document is the Highway Design Manual. The Highway Design Manual presents design standards and criteria based on the type of highway. So this covers all of ODOT's highways, from kind of interstates to urban highways like the heights, and more rural highways. It also presents information based on the project type. There are several different project types, from kind of a modernization, where they're kind of bringing an old highway roadway up to current standards, kind of modernization, kind of thinking adding lanes, adding intersections, things like that. They also have pavement preservation, kind of going through doing pavement overlays, rehab, operational projects, and then safety projects. And so a safety project is probably more typical of what future improvements along the heights would look like. The Highway Design Manual presents the design controls based on the scope of the improvements. And so more comprehensive projects have to kind of be brought entirely up to kind of current best practices or the required standards, whereas smaller kind of pavement preservation address less. The Highway Design Manual also documents the process for obtaining any exceptions from the standard design criteria. And so they outline that process. Examples of those, of something that would be required, a design exception, is the Highway Design Manual does not allow angle parking on a state highway. So you would have to get a design exception to do angle parking on a state highway. Or if you're looking to reduce the lane from the kind of, there's a minimum required width of 11 feet and you want to reach to 10, you have to go through and kind of do a design exception, and that outlines that process. The Highway Design Manual also talks about separate standards for special highway designations. And so I mentioned earlier that the 12th and 13th, 281 through the Heights are a non-designated highway. So they're not, there's no special designation. The Highway Design Manual talks about special transportation areas, commercial centers, and urban business areas that has specific kind of designation and different standards that can be followed if that sort of overlay has been designated. The design manuals from 2012, that process ODOT has recently realized is sort of out of date and kind of best practices for designing for urban highways. And so early last year, January 2020, they published this blueprint for urban design. It is what ODOT kind of refers to as a bridging document. So it kind of bridges from 2012 standards of the Highway Design Manual to current 2020 best practices. And it really looks to build on and improve ODOT's previous efforts to design for context, kind of thinking about making sure they're not just designing every highway the same, but really thinking about what that environment is that the highway is passing through. And so the blueprint for urban design, are also referred to as the BUD, builds on and improves the kind of their previous efforts for designing for context. It kind of, acknowledges the gaps and limitations that the Highway Design Manual had by limiting call it the buckets of roadways to kind of an urban highway or a rural highway or this special designation. And the intent is to generate more design flexibility for state highway projects without having to get as many design exceptions. So the previous approach focused more on getting a special designation, going through an ODOT process to get that. I think generally, Tara could probably correct me, I think those had to kind of go through the kind of formal Transportation Commission process to the state. And generally the kind of 2012 Highway Design Manual is kind of less flexible. So this new approach really focuses on designing for the land use context. It generally eliminates the need for special transportation areas that would be thought of, that would probably apply to the Heights District, and focuses instead on kind of the various land use contexts. So this is a diagram from the ODOT Design Manual that kind of illustrates the varying contexts that you see moving from urban to rural. And so the BUD focuses on designing for a performance, context-sensitive, practical design approach. And they've expanded their kind of highway context designations for the urban environment to have 6 designations. There's a kind of downtown or central business district. There is urban mix. Let's see if I can get my cursor on there. So there's kind of this urban mix. And these are really the 2 land use contexts that we're looking at that exist today in the Heights. There's also a kind of commercial corridor, generally think of this as kind of more kind of big box frontages, kind of more multi-lane roadway, residential corridor, suburban fringe, and rural communities. And so the BUD, or Blueprint for Urban Design, kind of outlines how land use informs design and basically makes recommendations based on that land use, different modal priorities, and the roadway function to present refined design criteria that can be applied to develop kind of cross sections in the design. I might pause there for a second, see if anyone has any questions based on what we've talked through so far, or if there's anything that Tara from ODOT would like to add or expand on that I've said.
Tara, how are we doing? We're talking a lot about your organizations and rules and regulations. Are we translating appropriately and give you a fair assessment?
You are being very kind. Yes. No, I think all of that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, the BUD, the purpose of the BUD is to provide that flexibility and that, you know, not one size fits all, and kind of that awareness that every highway serves a different need in a community. So yeah, nothing additional.
Okay, great. Anyone else from the agency board or advisory committee or planning commission that kind of have a quick question, or if not, we can kind of keep.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Is there anything about speed that was in those manuals that says we can't lower the speed?
There is, and we'll kind of walk through that a little bit based on the kind of urban context recommendation. There are kind of ranges of posted speed that should be or kind of suggested as the target. And so there's nothing that I guess would say precludes or prevents from kind of wanting to reassign posted speed limit. I know John with TKS might be able to talk a little bit more, or even Tara, about kind of the process to go through and what's required to reassign a speed limit, but I don't think there's anything in here that precludes any of doing that.
And Mayor, we have thinking about 3 or 4 slides. We're gonna have a speed discussion.
So what I did on the next slide is kind of grabbed, from those 6 kind of urban context designations. Here are the 3 that, based on name only, might sound more urban and appropriate for something that goes through the heights. So I'll start left to right. These examples are actually just screenshots from the Blueprint for Urban Design manual. So they're directly from the ODOT document. So on the left is the kind of central business district example. This is in Silverton, and it's shockingly similar to what the heights looks like, particularly on 12th, where the density is a little bit higher. It's more continuous 0 lot line frontages. The middle street view image is from Cannon Beach. It's an urban mix. And I know, at least for me, I kind of see some similarities here for how 13th looks and feels today. There's, consistent development patterns along the street, kind of smaller scale. Some are close to the street, some are set back a little bit. There are some driveways. And then the one on the right is a commercial corridor. And this is where earlier I mentioned kind of commercial corridor. In my mind, I kind of picture bigger boxes, kind of more lanes, kind of groups driveway access. And so, doesn't quite have that same context. The table below is, again, a kind of excerpt from the BUD. And this kind of shows kind of how different modes should generally be considered when you're looking at the urban context. And so you can see the kind of traditional downtown or central business district and the urban mix are very similar. Same kind of pedestrian, bicycle, transit, freight. The slight difference is at the motorist. And you can see how the commercial corridor, it really focuses on kind of more motorist, freight, transit, kind of goes along with how that corridor looks and feels from a visual standpoint, at least in my opinion. So I don't know how clear this text is, but so the high stands for highest level facility should be considered and prioritized over other modal treatments. So here they're saying in the traditional downtown central business district and urban mix, pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit should be prioritized over other modes. Low is incorporate design space, incorporate design elements as space permits. So, we want to accommodate and make sure that, freight can get through, but you're not designing for them. And then medium, design elements should be considered. Trade-offs may exist based on desired outcomes and user needs. So, for urban mix, there's a little more priority to cars. And this is kind of very, very general terms. So I mentioned actually I'm going to flip back real quick, kind of how you determine that urban context. Again, this is sort of part of one of the memos that we included, but we're looking at sort of land use, modal priorities, and roadway function. And so of those kind of different buckets, looking at the land use context. And this was kind of the first 2 pages of the urban context recommendation that our project team made with feedback from the city and delivered to ODOT. And so when we talk about land use, we're looking at the setbacks from buildings to the property line. So how close or far are buildings to the right-of-way line? Are they shallow? Is there no setback, zero lot line development? Are they shallow or are they larger setbacks? Also looking at the building orientation. So do those storefronts and doors, are they accessed from sidewalks on 12th or 13th, or are they on side streets? And one of the things that when we went through and looked at some of the existing land use, which we know is planned and likely to change over time, some of the building orientation, particularly along 13th, was a little bit more focused on the east-west streets, particularly, at the corners. We have relatively short blocks. So we did see some of that kind of urban mix building orientation on 13th. From a land use, what are the kind of existing and future mix of land uses? I think on 12th, there's definitely, there are probably mostly kind of there's not much mixed use out there now, but there's the desire to have kind of mixed use along 12th and 13th in the future. Building coverage, the percent of area adjacent to the right-of-way with buildings as opposed to parking and landscape or other uses. So 12th, definitely kind of from observations, has higher building coverage. There's, a few vacant lots along 13th. There are a few surface parking lots. So it's kind of the kind of observations we saw there. Parking, location of parking in relation to the buildings along the right-of-way. We've got on-street parking on both streets. There is a little more access to off-street parking along 13th. And then block size, which are both very consistent. And so same thing that we kind of covered in the urban context recommendation memo, 12th really kind of looks and feels like this kind of central business district setting today. 13th looks and feels a little bit more urban mix. But when you look at the kind of land use kind of planning that's out there and kind of, I think the goals of the city and community really see both 12th and 13th likely falling in that kind of central business district from a land use context. And this is all kind of similar information that was included in that our recommendation memo. And so here, taking that as kind of what is the urban context for 12th? So our recommendation to ODOT was kind of central business district. And so Chair McBride, your kind of question on speed, here you can kind of see how the kind of from the ODOT blueprint for urban design, kind of where they see a target speed for these two different types of contexts that exist today along 12th and 13th Street. So really looking at 20 to 25, so slightly lower than what's posted speed limit out there as 25 miles an hour, slightly higher on the urban mix. Otherwise, when you look across this table, there's a little bit of difference there, but otherwise, all of this kind of column 3, travel lanes, turn lanes, shy distance, medians, all of those vehicle information and kind of guidance is all the same across central business district and urban mix. You start to see the difference on kind of bicycle facility. For the central business district, start with separated bicycle facility, whereas urban mix start with separated but consider the roadway characteristics. Sidewalk is similar. Target pedestrian crossing spacing is similar, and so this goes back to, I know there have been some recent crosswalks that have been removed. I think it's Hull, or there's 1 or 2 intersections that have no crosswalks at them, and you start to kind of get to that higher length of distance between pedestrian crossings. And then the last column I think is really important, given the discussion that we had in phase 1 with stakeholders and with you guys related to on-street parking. Because I think this is a kind of important difference, at least in the way that ODOT presents information. And so in that more central business district setting, which is what our context recommendation was, it's include on-street parking if possible. Whereas in the urban mix, consider on-street parking if space allows. So pretty different guidance there. One of the things that we do have very limited space, 60-foot wide right-of-ways. So I think that's an interesting kind of consideration as we look at and start developing concepts. A couple other bullets that I just kind of wanted to highlight that were kind of supporting this table. So in central business districts, higher levels of traffic congestion are expected, whereas in urban mix, higher levels of congestion are acceptable. So kind of a little bit different, and I know depending on kind of the stakeholders and the community member, these kind of strike right to some of the things that we've kind of been hearing and talking about, and what does that future of 12th and 13th look like? Look and feel and experience. So those are the different contexts. What does that mean in terms of doing design and looking at cross sections? Not a whole lot. So these are side by side. On the left are the BUD's design recommendations for kind of street cross section for your central business district. And on the right are the recommendations for urban mix. All of these numbers are very similar. And I essentially would say they're basically the same, especially when you consider that we're going to be trying to fit accommodations for the different modes and streetscape environment within a 60-foot right-of-way. So we're really going to be looking at the minimum or less than the minimum places. And so while I think it's important to kind of understand what that urban context plan is, from a design standpoint, they're very similar. But it does, you go back to that kind of level of traffic congestion that's expected versus acceptable, and the on-street parking conversation, which we know parking is a very important part of this project. So that's a kind of overview of how the BUD kind of categorizes the different urban highway contexts. And I'd like to pause there again to see if there are any questions based on kind of what I just talked through or the urban context recommendation memo that we had included in your packet.
I got a question about the speed too, and I appreciate that the mayor brought that up. The posted speed is 25 on both sides, 12th and 13th, but as we heard from the police chief, the acceptable speed is in excess of 35 before they will enforce speed up there, and so it makes a really good argument for designing the roadway to decrease the speed or to discourage speed.
Correct. Yeah, I think one of the things that you can post something, it doesn't matter where you are. You know, if you post the speed at something that doesn't reflect the space and the design of the street that's there, you're going to get people that, you know, it feels much more comfortable to go faster. And when you're in your car, that might be just fine. But if you're someone that's out there walking across the street, trying to move through the corridor and across the street with your kids, your dog, your family members, on a bike, it really kind of takes away from your experience. And so yeah, all of the kind of tools that we'll be looking at as we develop kind of design concepts, we'll be making sure that we're kind of looking at kind of dimensions. And because we're, you know, we've got 60 feet, we're going to be on that minimum range for basically everything. And so that will help kind of slow cars down, in addition to kind of any other more formal kind of traffic speed change that might be desired.
Nathan, I have another question.
Yeah.
On the pedestrian realm,
Yes.
pedestrian zone and buffer zone. So are both of those components of a sidewalk, or what do those terms mean?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I'll kind of walk, and so this generally goes, the kind of the top of the table goes from the right of way towards the curb. And so the frontage zone is that space that's kind of right at the face of building. And so it's kind of think about it as you're kind of where you have potentially some kind of shy distance, or kind of some in the downtown environment, people might have, you know, sandwich board signs out, or some kind of things that they're selling on the street. The pedestrian zone is really kind of the through zone for people that are kind of walking along the corridor. And the buffer zone is the setback from, whether it be from the roadway. You know, in some places it might be along next to a parking, some places it might need next to a bike lane, but it's that setback from the roadway. And then the curb and gutter is, I think, sort of self-explanatory, and kind of state highway requirements, depending on speed, there are tendencies to kind of want to have more space, or kind of the 6-inch might be just the vertical curb, whereas the 2-foot would allow for a curb and gutter. So, you know, part of the roadway. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Nathan, I just have a quick note on the speed zone stuff. I couldn't get to my mute button fast enough earlier. If any of you have gone through a speed zone change request with ODOT in the past, I know about 1.5 years ago, they did change their process a bit. And the biggest change is before it was largely based on an engineering study. They do a speed survey, and they were really targeting the 85th percentile speed. So the speed that they were going to post it at was going to be towards the higher range of speeds that were out there. So now one of the big changes is inside city limits, they'll look at the 50th percentile. So that's lowered a bit. So it's probably a lot easier to get that lowered. Although I'm guessing in this case, if you're already posted 25, so you would probably be looking to get to 20. And if the locals have figured out they can drive closer to 35 without getting a ticket, my guess is the 50th percentile still is probably no lower than 25. But they also will consider crash data and the land use context, just as Nathan was showing you how they have those speed ranges. So for that, the CBD, that speed range is 20 to 25. So like I said, not to say that, you know, it would still be an easy process or a given, but I know it did change, and it's a bit more flexible and considers the context and uses kind of a lower target these days.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, as we're thinking about concepts, and you know, even going back to some of the work that had been done kind of previous to our team starting, and kind of looking back at kind of some of the suggestions of kind of like Dan Burton's walk shop, you know, there are potential options where there's a little more auto focus on 13th for moving kind of traffic through, and kind of thinking of that as more of a state highway route, and 12th as more of a, you know, commercial Main Street type setting. And so it's possible in that type of situation, you could have a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit on one and then kind of work to get a lower speed limit on the kind of street that looks and feels and operates differently.
This question is for Tara. The cross streets in the boundary, can you not put diagonal parking on those streets?
I'm actually going to punt to the city because
Yeah.
ODOT doesn't have any control over the side streets.
Yeah, that's a great question, Megan. Yeah, so kind of going back, all those east-west streets that were not highlighted yellow, those are under the city's jurisdiction, and they can kind of follow kind of regular, I guess what I would refer to as the AASHTO sort of road design standards, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, and they can kind of program that right of way differently, and there's much more flexibility there. And so, yeah, putting angle parking on there, as long as we're able to kind of comfortably and safely kind of accommodate turns and kind of meet the kind of needs of 12th and 13th, should not be a problem. One of the challenges does become, there's a continuous alley network to Belmont to Taylor, and so you kind of make sure that you have kind of sight distance in your alleys, so that takes a little bit of space out, and there's some driveways on some blocks, so it's it's kind of finding the streets that you can kind of get the most bang for your buck to kind of program that way.
Another question, and I know these are city streets, but we could also do one-ways on those east-west connectors too, if we wanted to.
Yes, it's my understanding that, as kind of reprogramming kind of the circulation within that, as long as it, still works from a safety standpoint and kind of flow standpoint, those are things that are on the table.
Kind of along the same lines, it sounded like to me when you were talking about that there's no angled parking on the highway except you would have to ask for an exception. And like, I don't know if Tara can tell us like how likely an exception like that would be on this highway, or, do we have a chance, or is it no way kind of? Yeah, so the highway design manual does talk about, it kind of says, you have to get an exception. There's also a following paragraph that kind of goes, in the right context and in the right areas, it is something that can be supported and would need to be, designed appropriately. But I think there's precedent for that. So Tara, I kind of spoke maybe for you a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that, the highway design manual does talk about that and kind of recognizes there are settings that it is appropriate for.
Sure. I wouldn't be making that decision, so take what I say with a grain of salt, but I know that our engineers are very nervous when there are parking maneuvers that require backing, especially on a state highway, just because of the increased risk of crashes and other conflicts for users. And I would be very careful if there were also cyclists or cycle facilities that those parkers would be crossing over. So that this is kind of the needle we have to thread with all of those users.
So currently, with the parking on 12th and 13th, there's no parking that doesn't require backing, unless you're the first person there.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We also don't like parallel parking all that much either.
And I'm wondering if if we still have 2 lanes of traffic moving, that makes backing a little bit safer, easier, I would think. So maybe that would be part of the consideration as well, but I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things that I at least have seen in kind of the state design manuals is where there's angle parking, they tend to want wider lanes than are typically needed on kind of a main street type environment. And so they'll want to allow kind of additional space to kind of allow for that maneuvering and kind of, I don't know if I would call it kind of a little kind of what the best phrase for that is, but just they kind of expect to have a wider travel lane next to angle parking than you probably really need, and then kind of an urban street setting. And that's one of the things that with a 60-foot right of way, you're really confined by. Any other questions on kind of any of this so far, or kind of even kind of more detailed questions looking down at kind of what these different design elements are? One of the things they don't have on here with what ODOT refers to as the transition realm is kind of the on-street, the kind of separated bike lane. One of the things that I know we will be looking at are two-way bike facilities. And so for those, we'd likely be looking at the NACTA, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, is an organization that started probably 7 or 8 years ago that's developed to provide design guidance to cities to allow more tools in their toolbox for designing for bikes in urban areas, recognizing that kind of the state highway level AASHTO design guides took a really long time to update. And so we'd be looking to the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide to kind of look at kind of dimensional kind of cross sections for kind of cycle track dimensions and kind of what is that separation from the roadway minimum, what's the separation from sidewalk if it's something that we're at sidewalk grade.
I had a question about the pedestrian zone. Do you know if our sidewalks there now are 8 feet wide? Because they don't seem 8 feet wide to me. And like all the buildings, at least where I am, like 12th, that are up to the sidewalk. So like if we have to make them wider, would that make the street narrower?
Most of the sidewalks are excluding the curb are like 9.5 feet on. So I would say sort of on average. So with the curb 10 feet, they feel narrower because you've got signs and other things kind of on the curb side, and then depending on what's right at the kind of building frontage. But typically most of them I would, if you called them 10. And I know I do remember kind of from flipping through Dan Bergen's workshop presentation, one of the things that he had commented on is the kind of street environment is generally, compared to looking at other communities kind of around the state and the country, is fairly, if I remember him, I want to say that he said they're kind of fairly free of clutter. They're narrow sidewalks and you have kind of less space, but they're not overly cluttered and kind of challenging to navigate from that perspective. That doesn't address kind of ADA needs and kind of accessibility. But. Okay, well, I'll keep going. So that's kind of working through the blueprint for urban design, which is the design manual that we'll be following. ODOT, we're hoping will confirm our urban context recommendation in the next week or two, which would kind of solidify that from a context standpoint and kind of help our conversations as we're developing preliminary concepts. When it gets back to kind of actually drawing up cross sections, doesn't make a whole lot of difference when you look at the minimums, but hopefully we'll have that soon.
Yeah, sorry. It's been sitting in my inbox for a while. Yeah, we concur with the CDD. So breaking news. Sorry for the delay on the response there.
Great. No, thanks for chiming in with that, Tara. That's what we were kind of hoping for and kind of expecting on a previous call with Tara, and it's great to get that formal concurrence.
We recorded this too, just so you know, Tara.
All right, so design. So looking at kind of design process. So we've gone through and we've identified the kind of local context, and we've established project goals. And that was kind of phase one. Tara has just confirmed our urban context designation from an ODOT manual standpoint. And so our next steps are to kind of start developing those preliminary concepts and evaluation criteria based on goals and kind of the intended outcomes or kind of performance categories. We'll use that evaluation criteria to evaluate the concepts. I think an important step of that next is then kind of identifying the potential design exceptions that require ODOT approval. As we go through and develop concepts and present to you all as kind of the agency board and advisory committee, I think it's very important that everyone is clear on, what is following ODOT standards and what is not, and kind of how many of those things are we expecting, and kind of how is that going to impact kind of ODOT approval process and timing. And then after having those conversations kind of with ODOT and, going out to the community to kind of get feedback, identifying and developing the preferred alternative. So the evaluation criteria, these are going to be specific to our project and to the heights. We don't want to kind of copy a evaluation criteria from a different project or community or state highway somewhere else. They're going to reflect the project goals and the desired outcomes that we've documented through our stakeholder conversations, the kind of public feedback that we got on the online survey, and our conversations with the kind of board and advisory committee. There'll be a combination of both kind of qualitative and quantitative. So there will, I mentioned DKS is going to be doing kind of traffic analysis. And so we'll have that kind of quantitative data, but a lot of it may be qualitative. And so an important part of that is kind of making sure, as we're presenting to kind of everyone on this call, as well as the kind of general public, is that, these are easy, kind of generally kind of understandable evaluation criteria. We want to make sure people can understand and provide feedback on those things. As we're looking at concept 1, 2, and 3, we want to be very consistent and objective in that methodology. And it's very important that we're kind of picking evaluation criteria that's going to help differentiate between these three, because we don't want to have a bunch of things that are going to score them the same and kind of not lead to productive conversations with the stakeholders and folks on this call. And again, we do plan to engage with the board and the advisory committee as we kind of have a kind of preliminary set of evaluation criteria to talk about. So that's kind of through design process, looking towards the end of the kind of project, phase 3. The final plan that's developed will want to be and need to be integrated into the city's TSB, or the transportation system plan. The city needs to do that to be eligible for state funding. ODOT approves the TSP process. I also wanted to kind of point out that our scope includes sort of a markup of the existing TSP, but that kind of actual approval and adoption process is not part of this project scope as planned right now. One of the things that's also not really part of this project, and we'll want to think through kind of depending on where we land on concepts, is that from the ODOT Highway Design Manual, quote, plans should not be adopted with non-standard highway features unless a design exception has been approved by the state traffic roadway engineer, or the state traffic roadway engineer has indicated in writing that one would likely be approved. The design manual gets into more detail on that, depending on kind of how far out your project is from kind of doing design and implementation. And so they talk about, if you're within 5 years, you should contact the kind of region roadway manager to assist in putting that, design exception request. If you're 5 to 10, do this. If you're farther out, no formal action is required, but non-standard items should not be shown on the plans or so that's going to be an important part kind of as we get through identifying that preferred concept and kind of figuring out what that documentation process looks like. And again, the kind of actual documentation is not part of this project scope, and the reasoning for that is not knowing where we would land, how to kind of include that.
Can I add just two quick things to the end of
Yes,
that.
please do.
So with the blueprint for urban design, if what you end up with as part of your design is consistent with the BUD, this whole process goes away because there's concurrence built into the document that MIG and DKS will be going through. So the design exception is only if you are outside of what the highway design manual says and what the BUD says. If you're consistent with the BUD, but not necessarily the HDM, that's okay. The other caveat I want to throw out there is that the blueprint for urban design is really new. I think it was, what'd you say, January of 2020.
Mhm.
And while we have gone through the process with a couple of jurisdictions, it's still relatively early in its life cycle. And so we're still waiting to see how we have not yet taken a project from kind of this design planning through to implementation using the BUD, using the standards concurred early on in the process. And so I don't want to discourage, but I just want to, openly and transparently say that this is kind of a new thing, and we're all kind of learning together. And it remains to be seen exactly how this plays out as you go to construct. So you all are new wave, riding the edge of innovation here. So just wanted to point that out.
Yes, thank you for adding that, Tara. Any questions?
Hey, yeah, I have three. First one is probably the easiest. I assume you're going to get the traffic counts back from DKS before the concepts are drawn.
Yeah, so the parking count. So we've got the existing traffic data and study was done previously, kind of by the previous consultant. So that's parking. And yes, we'll have that information. And part of our plan as we're presenting the concepts to the community and to you guys is that parking study scope also included a kind of task to kind of do a calculation to kind of say, okay, here's the existing parking counts. What is the parking count kind of expectation for the different concepts? So we can kind of have that be part of the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yes. And the second question is in relation to goal 4, which is about recreation. I read that as creating a sense of place for the community to gather. I mean, it says create streets and gathering spaces. And I know that Anna Williams' House Bill 3304 relating to state highway and rural communities, the report back on that in relation to the BUD is not due back until, I'm seeing September 15th, 2022. I know that her inspiration for that House bill was particularly the parklet issue on state highways. And my question is, if that report is not due back until September 15th, 2022, and currently parklets are not allowed on state highways, will one of the concepts include community and or gathering places other than the highway?
So they can. Yeah, I think,
Okay.
As we're looking at how to program the space between 12th and 13th on those east-west streets, I think there definitely can be some opportunities. And I also think can be opportunities to kind of formalize kind of, a temporary parklet as a kind of expanded curb extension in kind of the right places. And whether that's, somewhere, is it something that kind of coincides with kind of the Pine Taylor crossing or Ann Wilson that kind of, are those kind of seen as based on past planning work as well as feedback through the online survey? That's where a lot of people are coming and kind of east-west and moving through, and would be, I think, good opportunities for kind of places to kind of create those spaces. So yes, they could be on the east-west streets. that are not under ODOT jurisdiction. They could be something instead of temporary parklets, formal kind of sidewalk space that would take away from parking but add value different ways.
Right. The trade-off being on the highway versus doing what Slopeswell did, which is making use of their alleyway. Being that it's a quieter experience behind in the alleyway where you can actually talk to each other. And then my third question is a little bit more meaty in regarding, I know you guys are worth every penny, but this is a very expensive plan and process, and arguably you could use that money to do, I mean, we're not going to see bike lanes go in, especially cycle tracks, knowing that they're upwards of $20 million going in for another 5 years. And the immediate need right now is safety. So part of your scope of work was demonstration project proposals. And I want to know what the reality of those happening.
So I think, when we put the scope together and working with kind of Will and kind of city staff to kind of figure out kind of, that was included, I think, at least in my mind, it was sort of something we get developed concepts. There is a preferred concept that is preferred by many in the community, and maybe there are some kind of questions about it. That becomes a good opportunity to potentially test something out. So that would be kind of one timing kind of in the way I could see that playing out based on kind of the way we were thinking from a kind of process flow standpoint.
Yeah, I think the question, I jump in with the kind of test cases, are there, as Nathan said, are there concepts that the community likes, but there's still questions about that? So can we, temporary stripe or add different things to be able to test those without putting those, the more expensive improvements in there to be able to test some of those options early. So that those test cases, that'll be determined, once we get through the concepts and see where things start to fall, to be honest, about kind of what those look like. And then what are the specific actions that might come to be as a part of whatever that recommendation is. And so that'll be definitely something we'd be talking to you in future meetings about, and kind of what that might start to look like once we get through the concepts. I wanted to, sorry Nathan to jump in, I wanted to ask Dustin, maybe to put you on the spot on the parklet conversation. I know, like, from a state highway standpoint, as Nathan said, permanent curb extensions or others that would add more space to be a parklet, or more of a permanent public space, that would be something we could look at on 12th and 13th. But the middle streets, the connecting streets, is there anything within the city code that restricts parklets on those cross streets that would restrict that now, per se?
There's not an outright prohibition. And I think, we'd be looking at it really as on a case-by-case basis. Is it appropriate? Are there the appropriate visibility items? But there's no outright prohibition. There may be instances where it's not the right place and we wouldn't allow it. But on the city streets, that's our jurisdiction. And just in general on the state highway, not unique to parklets, but features in general, this is the opportunity as we move through to test some of those and evaluate some of those, anything that becomes a design exception. So I think that's where, whether the parklet becomes a, or some park feature that is incorporated into the right of way, that would be something that I think we, again, depending on how our alignment occurs with state rules, we may want to, this would be the opportunity to look at that. So I think it's kind of the segue into, what happens when things don't align.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dustin.
Can I ask another question along those lines?
Yeah.
I'm wondering about those east-west streets. So this project that you're working on will design a lot of the features on 12th and 13th, but designing them on the side streets would be something the city does. Is that right? Or is that incorporated into this project? Because it's between those two streets.
Yeah, we're primarily from a kind of scope standpoint kind of focused on the 281 couplet, but recognizing the way kind of the circulation and kind of traffic patterns, not just vehicular, but kind of people moving through this corridor, those east to west streets become critical to the Heights as a district. And so we are looking at those kind of, there might be a slightly different level of touch that we get into, but it's definitely something that we're doing.
And then a second question, the whole time plan for this whole project, what is that?
So we're probably looking at about another, 8 to 12 months. So kind of the phase one went longer than we had planned. I think when we started this, we were kind of thinking 12 to 15 month project. It's August now. We're kind of early in phase two. There's kind of a combination of factors that have led to that. But I would kind of hope to say, we're wrapped up in 8 to 12 months ish. One of the things we need to do is kind of go back and kind of look at the timing for ongoing kind of public engagement and making sure that we're engaging with stakeholders in the community at a time that is smart. But we also don't want this to go on very long. It's important to keep the momentum, but that's kind of the general time frame.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question about the traffic counts. I know we already have traffic counts. Have those traffic counts already determined that we cannot go down to one lane on 12th and 13th? We have to have 2 lanes going, one direction on one street and 2 lanes going one direction on the opposite direction. Has that been determined already?
Nope. So right now, all that's happened is kind of existing kind of traffic counts have been done. What we'll be doing, we'll be developing these 3 different concepts, and DKS will be using kind of the kind of new intersection designs and kind of cross sections of the roadway to develop kind of that future forecasting of traffic counts and kind of how slowly cars move through, what the delay is for vehicles moving through. And we'll be looking at that in the context of how that relates. I think primarily, and John chime in, kind of how does that relate to the mobility targets that are set in the Oregon Highway Plan?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, one question that could come up is, even if you're not meeting mobility targets, right, that are established, is there a level of congestion that might be beyond that you still think is acceptable, right? And maybe there's still a conversation to be had just about changing the expectation for the level of congestion in that area. But we'll see what it looks like when we get there.
I think in short, the answer is, based on the counts, it's not a foregone conclusion that it's a 2-lane couplet or nothing or failure. I think I don't think we don't have the numbers that suggest that.
Okay, so what if kind of we've gone through kind of the design kind of recommendations from the kind of blueprint for urban design, kind of what those sort of standards are, and what if the city and ODOT's and kind of community's desires for 12th and 13th don't align? So as an ODOT roadway, ODOT gets the final decision making on state-owned roadways, and that doesn't matter whether it's a state-led project or a local agency city-led project. And so, that is why, a couple of years ago, that went out and removed crosswalks that were crossing 12th and 13th. They had said that, those had been installed without ODOT engineering approval, at least kind of that's the flyer said, and they had conducted their study, and because they have the jurisdiction and make the final say, they were able to do that. And so for our project, what do potential scenarios look like where city and ODOT have a different take? That's something that could be very high level, kind of project level. We were just talking about kind of the traffic considerations or those mobility targets not being achieved that are set in the Oregon Highway Plan. And so there is a process where you can kind of set an alternate mobility target It has to go through and be adopted by the Oregon Transportation Commission through a facility plan. There's a statement that talks about kind of that process. To allow that, you have to look at all the feasible options before choosing a new target. So that's kind of a high level thing that could kind of say, oh, this doesn't really work for us. Crosswalks at desired locations are not supported. There could be a potential where, you know, ODOT's stance, even with the kind of fully revisioned kind of corridor, they take a different stance on crosswalks, or the parklets conversations that are not allowed. Might be something at a design level where there are a lot of design exceptions that stack up. The TSP does note that the traffic signal that's proposed at 13th and May in the city's current TSP does require a design exception. We talked about angle parking would require approval. So there could be a point where there's a lot of design exceptions that become kind of concerns from ODOT's side. And when we were kind of talking with John this last couple of weeks, another thing that he mentioned is it might sort of be process related. And John mentioned that the intersection designs, like if you were to look at a roundabout, might require a kind of special review process that kind of goes through ODOT's Mobility Advisory Committee. And so that's additional kind of regulatory process and time. And so, you know, if for some reason these things start to become too many hurdles for the city to take on, then what is the alternative to that process? And, you know, what we talked about early on in that kind of first kind of contract approval is, you know, potentially the idea of a jurisdictional transfer. You know, rather than having to follow state highway regulations and design standards, it get transferred to the city, and the city would have jurisdiction over it just like they do their other streets. Typically, this happens with some new level investment. The city, you know, gets kind of a brand new road, gets improved facilities. The benefit to ODOT is they're no longer on the hook for maintaining that roadway in the future. The kind of that the pavement striping, it removes the liability from them. There was the Oregon Active Transportation Summit earlier this year. There was a program session just kind of talking about kind of jurisdictional transfers, and there was a recent, as a part of that presentation, someone presented about or at Oregon Metro had completed a kind of study of completed highway transfers. And so I've included a link in the slides to that study. But one of the things when they went back and looked at historically why agencies pursue a jurisdictional transfer, there were sort of three themes that arose: kind of incentive and mutual benefits, roadway maintenance and design standards, and consistency with current land use. And that third theme, consistency with current land use, is one that I think ODOT is expecting to go away with the kind of the new Blueprint for Urban Design manual. So what do those three things mean? And kind of from that document, I kind of just grabbed kind of their description, and I'll just read these for the three kind of common reasons for jurisdictional transfer. So incentive and mutual benefits. Initiated when the state and local jurisdiction have incentive to execute the transfer. Case studies indicate the local jurisdictions are motivated by the community's desire for an improved roadway, and when a change in roadway function will prioritize non-automobile travel modes to improve safety, traffic safety, or support desired land use outcomes. Transfer is easiest when funding is available, for example, through state legislature, to upgrade the road prior to transfer. Frequently, transfers reduce maintenance costs and liability for the state, providing long-term financial incentive for the state to complete a transfer. Once the incentives are established, the state and local jurisdiction are motivated to complete the transfer by the prospect of mutual benefits. Because the jurisdictional transfer process is grounded in negotiations, transparent and frequent communication ensures that both parties will receive some type of benefit, a financial benefit or outcome that supports the agency's mission. So I'd say generally aligns with some of the things that we're talking about here for the Heights. And again, these are just kind of direct quotes from this kind of report that was prepared by Oregon Metro.
Can I add in that that sort of contradicts that graph that we looked at earlier where motorists are lower priority and pedestrian and bicycles are highest priority? That's almost a direct contradiction.
And that's that kind of chart is, you know, new, and this is kind of the historical reasons transfers have happened.
These haven't caught up with the new manual, it looks like.
Yeah. So a second theme that had been identified, roadway maintenance and design standards. Transfers frequently occur to improve a roadway's maintenance or change its design standards. ODOT design standards are consistent with the highway design manual, and many local jurisdictions use design standards with more flexibility for urban design. Design standards are dictated by a road's classification and may not be consistent with current or future uses of the roadway. Classifications also can relate to the level of funding a roadway receives from the state. Often in the context of limited funding, ODOT invests in maintenance of interstates or state highways first. So again, kind of with the new blueprint for urban design, ODOT is expecting, you know, probably to see less jurisdictional transfers as a result. And then the third theme, consistency with current land use. Transfers often occur to update physical conditions of a roadway. They also occur when a roadway's function is not consistent with current and future land use. Transferring road ownership to a local jurisdiction can help support development or redevelopment by aligning transportation and adjacent land use. The transfer process itself can facilitate development when the negotiation process results in a design that supports adjacent land uses. Negotiation also leads to creativity and compromise, resulting in an outcome for the roadway that may have otherwise been undiscovered. So these kind of just thought it would be helpful. I know jurisdictional transfer is something that has come up. I think there are some people that think it's maybe more of a potential outcome than others. You know, I think our plan is to kind of work through the design process and the kind of blueprint for urban design with the flexibility that's there. I thought it would be good just to kind of introduce kind of this as a discussion point, and thought it was helpful to kind of see historically why other cities have pursued a jurisdictional transfer.
So we've done a jurisdictional transfer. We did it last year.
Mm-hmm.
When we wanted to put parklets down on Oak Street, and we couldn't do that unless we did the transfer. We looked at the heights at the same time to some extent, but quickly took it off the list, really because the condition of the road was so much worse than anything we would be taking on Oak Street. And then ODOT also agreed that when some of the crosswalks needed some upgrades on Oak, on the side streets that went across Oak, there would be some compensation to the city, I believe, at that point. So, you know, there's just so much that needs to be done on 281 on the heights that the city didn't want to take on that amount of maintenance and reconstruction that it really needs right now. So that's why we took it off the list to quickly get it done down on Oak Street as fast as we could, so we could allow the parklets down there last winter.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you know, one of the things in kind of going through that kind of Oregon Metro document, it does kind of detail sort of exhaustively kind of the process and kind of working and developing kind of the financial assessment and doing that part, which is definitely not kind of MIG's expertise kind of background on that. You know, I think kind of looking for guidance on kind of process and kind of timing and kind of how that works, you know, kind of we would kind of look to ODOT and kind of city staff to kind of guide those discussions.
Yeah, and if I could jump in quickly, if you think about it, if it's kind of like buying a house, right? There's something on offer. Somebody, you know, the buying party, you know, the transfer reception person, you know, makes an offer and says, this is what I'm willing to do to have this change hands. And then there's a counteroffer. So every jurisdictional transfer is slightly different, you know, as Mayor McBride pointed out. the Oak Street transfer was relatively clean and simple. There were a few things, tweaks that here and there, but then there's way more complicated, like, currently we're working on 82nd Avenue in Portland, and we got money from the city, we got money from ODOT, we have money from the state legislature, just because, the condition of the house, if you will, just needed a lot of love. And that sounds like that's kind of the perception for the Heights. And so we have a basic framework for how we go about doing it, but in the end, everything is a negotiation, and it's, what funds are available, what work can we do, what work can you all do, and, where we can come to an agreement on that.
I wouldn't take the idea off the table, though.
Yeah, I think it was something we wanted to raise in this, just because it is complicated. Certainly, I think our expectation would be that any jurisdictional transfer discussion would be pretty deliberate, given some of the complexities and, the status of the roadway now, the plans that lay ahead, would be something that we would be, it would be ambitious and deliberate discussion between the agencies. Certainly I think that's our expectation.
Is the general plan to like come up with the concepts, including some concepts that would require exceptions? And then if like the concept that requires an exception wins, whatever, is the one that people want, and then ODOT doesn't give us an exception, and then we would then more go towards this jurisdictional transfer? Like, would that be the general process of this, or would it be before all that happens?
Yeah, that's how we see it. We're going to, as a kind of project team, working with city staff, and then also with the kind of board and kind of advisory committee, we're bringing to you different concepts for these streets. Kind of do our kind of work, do the design work, do the kind of evaluation of those, get the community feedback, and say, okay, while also meeting with ODOT to kind of start to gauge kind of where their concerns are. But yeah, until there's a kind of preferred alternative, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to potentially get into the jurisdictional transfer, unless it's something that the city just says, we really want to do this kind of regardless of the final concept that's been developed. So yes, I think we kind of go through the process, see what shakes out of it from a design standpoint, and then kind of re-engage that discussion as needed.
Okay, I guess I just wanted to make sure that we would still consider things that need exceptions during this whole process. We're not just gonna, oh, that needs an exception, we might not get it, we're not gonna even try to do it. So,
and if I may,
won't happen.
Yeah, if I may jump in, that's why I'm here tonight, and have been involved in the past and will continue to be involved in the future, is to take back to the decision makers at ODOT and kind of see where it could fall. Like, is this a relatively easy exception process? Does it fall within the bud, or does it not? And then there's a negotiation that needs to happen. So I'm kind of the through yarn for all of that, to make sure that those conversations are happening early and often. So there's not like, what I would hate is for you all to go through this long process and come to the end and realize that nothing is implementable, or it's a really long process. I'd like to raise, the issues like, maybe this is, maybe we could get an exception, maybe we couldn't, and kind of, just kind of raise that flag as the options are being developed and presented to you all.
Yeah, all design exceptions are not created equally. Some can be very simple and kind of easy to take care of. The highway design outlines the process and the documentation that's needed kind of generically to go through that process. And so they realize that happens frequently. And so that's something we're expecting, or kind of would expect, not necessarily to kind of do that documentation as a part of this scope, but the idea that there are design acceptance that would need to get approved. So that was sort of our last slide. So I will stop sharing screen. unless there are any slides that people want to go back and take a look at from anything from tonight. Otherwise, I guess kind of open it up for any kind of additional kind of questions or discussion on anything we've talked about or maybe haven't talked about tonight.
I hope you all have learned a lot. I know this is a lot of jargon. I try to make it not jargon heavy, but it is bureaucracy, multi-level bureaucracy. It is transportation engineering. There's a lot of acronyms. So, getting you all immersed in it and just trying to have some just candid, common sense talk is can be a challenge. But I think as you get, immersed, it's kind of like, transportation urban design boot camp, with the state. So it's awesome that you all are here. I think it just makes it a little more transparent and accessible and intelligible when we start getting into these things, when we talk about, the frontage zone and the BUD and the LOS, and, it can be a lot of planner code. So for those of you all are joining in at home too, I think this is a great opportunity to just come face to face with the management team, the project team, some of our subject matter experts, and just try to decode some of these things. Again, so when you see a design in front of you, you have some background and expectation of why does it look this way? Why are they avoiding the back out parking, or, what's driving some of these things? And, this is kind of our hometown, and, we have 60 feet of real estate to work with. And this is where we live and play. And, it's a lot of how we move throughout town. So it's really important to get those goals and to incorporate them in the process. And that's why hearing the community, speaking to those goals, and then moving it through the process is important. And I raise that because mention that, are we going to avoid just the design standard? And I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal is to follow the project goals, follow the community lead, and see how they're influenced by some of the regulations, and not just simply back into, here's how we comply with all the regulations. And hopefully what comes out of that is something we love. I think this is what we love. This is what is the value. Here's what happens when it hits the regulations. And I think that's the right process. And I'm excited we get to move into concepts in phase 2. This is really where we start seeing the vision take shape. And so it's a great opportunity to touch base. And this is where we kind of launch. So I know I could take up your time, but I'm happy that you all were here. Unless Jack is not here. So I was wondering if Pat wanted to talk about parking meters. I think that's where I cue parking meters for Pat. On behalf of Jack.
Yeah, you had to get me to say something tonight, didn't you, Dustin? Yeah, thanks. You took Jack's role very well. Thank you.
That's it.
Dustin,
That's
I
all
wanted to say thank you for all this. It's made it a whole bunch more transparent, and it's a lot easier to understand and be able to have a conversation with someone who's not been involved every day, but still impacted because of their business or their neighborhood or whatever. I feel like I learned a lot tonight, more than I have, about justifying our goals against the rules and maybe some of the history too. And it's nice to see that things are changing, even if, of course they're changing and they don't align with what's changed, or it wouldn't be changed. But I feel like we're moving in the right direction, and this is a good step forward. And even though we're kind of going in fits and spurts with all this meeting and not meeting, I just want to say thank you, because I think we're doing a good job. You guys are doing a good job.
Thanks.
Yeah. And again, this is kind of, we come up for these periodic, we become visible, but it's always moving in the background, and we do some of the, the sausage making, and try to come up with finished product and bring you all in when it's really important. And we need to choose directions, and for the agency board to set that direction, and for the community to set that direction is important. So we want to make sure that we're following through on that. And I'm just thankful that all our partners are willing to stick with this. It takes time, and it's, when you're out in front, as Tara said, we're kind of out in front of this process, and in some ways that's exciting to be to set some trends and to push the limit. But it's also, so what happens when you go down the path less traveled is, it's not always we're not following suit. So as a practitioner, it's exciting to push those limits, and it's exciting to kind of not take that path less traveled, but sometimes it can be a little rocky. So we appreciate you all sticking with it. And again, we're excited to do this. This is a huge community project, and it's a big honor to be here with y'all. So.
Dustin, I have a comment and a question really quick. I too want to thank you all for the work. I learned a lot myself. I wrote things down that way I can simplify and have conversations with folks. But with that being said, for those individuals that weren't able to tune in tonight, for some reason, don't tune into the YouTube channel, how is this getting communicated to the community in plain language? Here's the steps that we're at that have been taken. Here's where we're at, and here's where we're planning to go. Here's the outcome of this conversation.
Yeah, I think some of the documents that you have are on the website. I'm hoping that we can place our slide deck on that becomes available for people that didn't join in. I had people who contacted me ahead of time saying I couldn't be there, but they wanted to know what was happening. So we'll post I think we can post the slide deck, maybe do some executive summaries of it, because it's deep. It's 26 slides of a lot of that. I think we could break that down to the Reader's Digest version of here's what you missed. I think that could be really handy. And if you got 5 minutes to read it rather than an hour and a half to sit through planner engineer speak, it could be helpful.
And Councilor Rivera, I think it's time to update the website a little bit in terms of we're stepping out of phase 1. So identify what those successes were, and then we do have a lot of stuff on the website. Some of this will be pretty technical, that like what we talked about tonight, but others will be, other pieces are things that we can identify, like these were the key things we did in phase 1. This is where we're going in phase 2, and that'll help set us up for public engagement, whatever that looks like with Delta variant coming up with in the fall and early winter.
And in addition to website, I think we're ready to kind of do a post out to people's contacts that we have from the city's MailChimp. So, that's coming.
Now that we're all back from vacation, or most of us anyway, so.
Yeah, the workshop part, that was part of phase 2, is we pushed from phase 1 to kind of have some person-to-person contact with some hopes that there would be, there's a moment, I think a short season that we thought that was going to happen. We're going to have to continue to reassess when that happens. So that's becomes really one of the best ways to just have conversations with people. We can just talk with each other. And I'm just waiting, just waiting for it.
Someday.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. Very interesting. We're getting into the weeds, and then we'll get out of the weeds and get the plan, and then we'll have to get back down in the weeds again. But it's all good. Thanks, everyone.
Feel free to reach out if there are questions, and hopefully it's great to hear that you guys got something out of tonight and kind of can be kind of that kind of project champions to the community as we kind of go out with more information. So thank you.
I have one more quick question. Sorry. I was happy to see the inclusion of the Safe Routes to School planning process within the memo, and knowing that those concepts are coming out, well, some preliminary have already been coming out, based on the existing conditions of the heights. And so they're recommending things that, like removing the crosswalk on May Street by Providence Hospital, which is, I can't imagine that crosswalk not being there. So Tara assures me that there is coordination between all these plans happening. And I just wanted to raise that level of the plan coordination. I know Dustin is totally looking at that too. I'm taking my planning commission hat on. I'm putting on my train conductor hat on because it's back on in this fall. And last spring, the bike train had 3 very close calls. I would say very close. And I say this with the bike train brought me a lot of joy, and it brought a lot of kids a lot of joy. There were 3 very close fatal. One was a little girl that fell off the 12th Street sidewalk almost directly into a lane of cars. I say this as there's an immediate need for safety for human beings in the Heights. And I know this is going to be a great vision and a great plan, but I say this as we are all responsible as public servants to make our streets safer now. So just wanted to create that sense of urgency for our kids. Not to take my hat off.
A quick questions to the and I just emailed Justin on the kind of safe routes to school update. From a timing standpoint, so we haven't gotten an update from a couple months from them. So they're currently developing concepts based on the kind of walk that they did earlier in the spring. Okay. Yeah, that would be great to get and see as we start to look at our concepts.
Will, were you going to jump in? I thought you were going to close us out.
Oh,
You're gonna be the
I was just
closer.
gonna know that I got an update from Jonathan and Haley that they're still doing a lot of outreach, and so with school starting up, they sent me a really detailed, really comprehensive, really well put together outreach plan that had about 4 or 5 different touch points. So of where they're still collecting information from users. So I think they might be a little bit similar to us, kind of taking a while to get through phase 1. I think they're still in data collection, but certainly we're all one team and all one organization, and so we'll work together hand in hand.
All right. Well, thank you all again for taking time out of your lives. I don't know if Jackson Park is still going right now. You know, may have to do some field work out there in the real world. Your Heights site visit can begin now. It's beautiful out. So thank you all again for taking time with us, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.